It's one of the ugliest words in the English language. What is it? You'll have to stay tuned to find out.
There's a message true and glad for the sinful and the sad. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out. It will give them courage new, it will help them to be true. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out.
Ring out,
merrily ring,
the word,
speeding away,
Lord, have
message divine,
and see.
send it today.
Still far from Jesus, many live in
Lost
sin.
and those in doubt, darkness and doubt.
Welcome to the Truth and Love program. Let me start today by telling you about Melissa. Melissa closed the blinds in her living room, and she turned off the lights and sat in the darkness as tears began to form and a feeling of emptiness overwhelmed her. She's never felt so alone in all of her life. It was bad enough the last time that she discovered that Anthony, her husband, had been unfaithful. But this time, he just left her a very short note that said, "I've had enough. I'm moving in with my girlfriend." That ugly word that I mentioned a moment ago is the word adultery. Adultery. Scenarios like the one I just described play out all too often in our country. And the effects of these kinds of things can be so far-reaching that it's difficult to describe. It's been my unpleasant experience to have known of several people in my close circle of acquaintances and friends and family that have succumbed to temptation and committed adultery. And each time that I have learned of another occurrence like that, the questions are always the same. Why? How? How could that person do that? How could that person turn his or her back on family, on children? How could they turn their back on the Lord? Those are questions that can drive us crazy, sometimes trying to figure out. And so this is indeed a most unpleasant topic. But the nature of the topic is such that it demands that we study it. The Bible certainly addresses the issue. It addresses the topic of adultery, and it does so in very plain language. Now, it's my intention to deal delicately with this topic. I know there may be folks watching the program that are young. We hope that's the case. We like to have viewers of all ages. And with that being a possibility, we'll certainly handle this in a delicate manner. But we need to handle it the way God has said in His Word, and that we also pledge to do today. So what does the Bible say about this unpleasant topic? Well, first of all, let's talk about the causes. Why does it happen? Why do people commit adultery? Well, I'm convinced that nobody just simply wakes up one morning with happy marriage, happy home life, everything lovely and wonderful, wonderful relationship with God. Nobody wakes up one day in that condition and simply says to himself, "You know what? I think today I'll throw my life away. I think today I will tear up my home. I think that I'll just go ahead and ruin a handful of lives by committing adultery. Now, how do I get started with that? Now, that conversation doesn't happen. That's not the way that it works. Infidelity, unfaithfulness to one's spouse begins in the heart. It begins in the mind. You see, the person, by the time a person physically commits adultery, that person has already been for some time engaging and indulging in some kind of progressively more intense mental and emotional affairs. That's the way it happens. It happens progressively. It begins in the heart. It begins in the mind. And so when you talk about the cause or causes of adultery, that's where we have to begin. Ultimately, you can bring back the cause to an unguarded and an unprotected mind. And you know what? That should come as no surprise to us. You know, that's what we find when you analyze the situations, the circumstances where adultery has taken place. You find in discussing that with people and getting back into their history, you find that that's the case. They start the mental process first, and then it ultimately ends up in the physical act. But that should not surprise us, because Jesus said that that was exactly the way it happens. Open your New Testament to Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. And notice what the Lord said in verses 18 and 19. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. Now again, notice how Jesus described the process. He talked about things that are overt actions: adultery, fornication, theft, blasphemy, and such like. But He said those things proceed from the heart. They come from within a person. And so when a person commits adultery or fornication, the physical act is committed only because one has already taken his heart and his mind there. And those actions proceed from an unprotected and an unguarded mind or heart. Back in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus gave a stern warning about the importance of guarding our thoughts. Matthew 5, beginning in verse 27, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now you see that Jesus here gives a warning about guarding and protecting our minds and our thoughts. He reminded them of what they had heard, what the law of Moses had stated: "You shall not commit adultery." Jesus wanted for them to go further and recognize that adultery is something that begins in one's heart. He said, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery in his heart with her." And that's where adultery begins. And that's why it's so important to guard our hearts, to guard our minds, to watch out and be careful what we allow into our minds. And that's why pornography is so dangerous. It's so prevalent in our world, and not just in the printed form anymore. Much more often now, pornography is accessed through the internet. And those that don't guard themselves and guard their eyes and guard their minds and their hearts can get so caught up and wrapped up in pornography that they have these mental and emotional affairs for so often that when an opportunity arises for them to actually commit the physical act of adultery, they have already laid the groundwork and laid the foundation because they have not guarded their heart. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life." The things that make up our lives are things that are directly connected to Our hearts, our minds. If we fill our hearts, we fill our minds with pornography, immodesty, lust, passion, unbridled, it sets ourselves up to give in to the temptation for physical sin. But there's another contributing factor to adultery, not just our hearts. That's where it ultimately ends up. That's where it all starts. But another thing that can contribute to the temptation has to do with the condition of one's relationship with his spouse. You see, one may increase the severity of temptation for his spouse if the needs of that spouse are not being met in the home. You see, if the emotional and physical and social and companionship needs of a spouse, a wife or a husband, if those needs are not being met by the spouse, then he or she may become more susceptible to the temptation to have those needs met by someone else that they think will meet those needs. Now, please rest assured that does not in any way excuse an extramarital affair. It doesn't excuse adultery. I'm simply pointing out that it can contribute to the severity of the temptation on the part of another. In other words, if, for instance, if my wife's needs are not being met by me, then she may naturally look to find those needs to be met in someone else. And therefore the temptation is increased by the fact that I'm not being what I'm supposed to be as a husband. And so we must guard our hearts, we must guard our minds, we must guard our eyes, and we must make sure that we are not contributing to the severity of the temptations in another by not fulfilling our responsibilities in the home. Well, those are some of the matters related to cause. Now let's turn our attention to the consequences. What are the consequences of adultery? And if we really thought about these and allowed them to sink into our minds, I believe we'd be less tempted to give in to the temptation. Jesus said you can know a tree by its fruit. He made that stated that principle in Matthew 7, verses 16 through 20. You know a tree by the fruit it produces. What kind of fruit does the tree of adultery produce? Let me invite your attention to the 5th chapter of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs has a lot to say about adultery and about the temptation to adultery and about the need to watch out and to be protected and guarded against that temptation. And in Proverbs chapter 5, we find Solomon talking about the consequences of giving in to that temptation, giving in to the seductress and committing adultery. Look at these in Proverbs 5, beginning in verse 10. Well, first of all, you go back and you see the command in verse 8, Proverbs 5, remove your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, talking about the adulteress. Why? Verse 10, lest aliens be filled with your wealth and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. He says here that one of the consequences of committing adultery can be the loss of your wealth, the loss of money, the loss of material possessions. You ever hear of alimony? Child support. Why do people have to pay alimony, child support? Well, in many cases it's because of adultery. It's because they gave in to the temptation and it ended their marriage, and now they're in a position to where their wealth is being taken because of their indiscretion. Look at verse number 11, Proverbs 5. And lest you aliens be filled with your wealth, verse 11, and you mourn at last when your flesh and your body are consumed. Talks about the consumption of flesh and body. In other words, physical health can be affected. How many diseases do some people have to deal with because of adultery? I'm talking about physical diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, and the like. Loss of physical health. What about a loss of your mental health and stability? Proverbs 5:12 and 13. And you say, how I have hated instruction, and my heart despised correction. I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. Here's the man who's crying out in recognizing the fact that he didn't listen. He should have listened and he didn't. And it's tormenting him. So one can be overcome with guilt and shame. David in Psalm 51 verse 3, in responding to his guilt over the sin of adultery, he said, my sin is ever before me. I've spoken with those that have been guilty of adultery. And I guess if there's one thing that they carry with them, it's that. If they have a heart that's still pliable and can be touched by truth, they carry with them guilt and shame. My sin is ever before me. It's one of the consequences of adultery. What about the loss of one's reputation? Look at Proverbs 5, verse 14. I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. He's talking about how others saw him and the fact that others did and others knew who he was and knew what he had done. In the midst of the congregation, I was on the verge of total ruin. And so in those few short verses, verses 10 through 14 of Proverbs 5, you have these consequences that accompany the sin of adultery: loss of wealth, loss of physical health, loss of emotional health, loss of reputation. And look in the next chapter, chapter 6, verse 33. Wounds and dishonor he will get, and his reproach will not be wiped away. Again, he's talking about the one who succumbs to the temptation of the adulteress. You know, another of the consequences of this sin is the temptation to increase sin, to add sin upon sin. We mentioned in passing David's adultery that he committed with Bathsheba, and after that sin had been committed, you read about how David then tried to cover it up. His adultery led him to be tempted, and then he gave in to the temptation to try to cover up that sin. And it led to deceit and murder. But it began with an unguarded and unprotected mind, which led to adultery. Now, forgiveness is certainly possible. And the consequences of adultery don't have to be eternal torment. You can be forgiven, as David was. And he talked about how blessed a condition he was in because of his forgiveness. Psalm 32, verses 1 and 2. Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11, and talked about some of the sins that they had come out of. And adultery was one of the ones that he mentioned. He said, such were some of you, but you were washed, sanctified, and justified. And so, yes, you can be forgiven of the sin of adultery, but many times, though the guilt of that sin is washed away, the consequences remain. The consequences remain. And so consider the consequences before you give in to that temptation. Well, we've looked at the cause, we've looked at the consequences. Now let's take a few minutes and consider prevention. How do you prevent this? How do you keep from giving in to the temptation to commit adultery? Let me offer you just a few ideas. First of all, let me encourage you to develop a hatred for sin. Just in general, we need to develop a hatred, and I mean that word in the strongest way that I can, a hatred for sin. David said in Psalm 119, verse 104, through your precepts I get understanding. Therefore I hate every false way. Is that your attitude towards sin? Do you hate sin? Paul encouraged in Romans 12, verse 9, abhor that which is evil and cleave to that which is good. Too many times I'm afraid we don't hate sin. We just decide we can live with it. We may consider it to be bad or not the best or something like that, but we get a little cozy with it. We get a little comfortable with it. If we develop a firm hatred for sin, that'll go a long way in helping us not only avoid this sin of adultery, but all others as well. Abhor that which is evil. Cleave to that which is good. Hate the evil and love the good. Amos 5, verse 15. But second, I would encourage you to protect what goes into your mind. You want to avoid the sin of adultery? Protect what goes into your mind. I mentioned earlier about the need to guard ourselves against pornography. And it is so prevalent in our day and time, and can be difficult to keep oneself from if we're not careful. But it's not just magazines and internet. There are things that can corrupt our minds that you can see on network television. You can go to the movie theater and see a lot of these kinds of things. So guard yourself, protect yourself from it. Adultery as an act is very, very seldom portrayed on television as being bad, unacceptable. The television shows that we watch, the movies that we see, whenever adultery is committed, it's usually just kind of a side reference, a side point. It's not considered to be an evil thing, the evil thing that it actually is. I wonder if in the process we don't allow ourselves to get desensitized to sin. And what is shown to us over and over and over again on television as being acceptable, maybe we begin to think that it is. It's hard to be entertained by something that you hate. And if we're supposed to hate the evil and love the good, Amos 5:15, and yet we allow ourselves to be entertained, to enjoy adultery on television and movies and things like that. It's hard to be entertained by something you hate. If you're entertained by those things, I would submit you don't really hate them. Guard what goes into your mind. Protect yourself. Get some kind of filtering system for your computer that filters out all of that nastiness and filth that we don't need to be looking at anyway. Turn off the television if you have to. Get rid of it if you have to. Whatever it takes to protect your heart, protect your mind, and protect your marriage. Let me encourage you as well to flee adultery. Flee fornication. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18. Flee youthful lusts. 2 Timothy 2, verse 22. Flee it as if your life depended on it, because it does. Follow the example of Joseph in Genesis 39, verse 12, who, when he was approached by Potiphar's wife, who tried to grab him and force him into an adulterous encounter, he left his coat in her hand and left and ran away. That's what you need to do. Flee fornication. And then I would encourage you to work on your own marriage. Busy yourself so much serving each other in your marriage that your commitment deepens and you become intoxicated with her love. Proverbs 5, verse 19. And then number 5, don't allow yourself to be distracted by the flattery and attention of someone else. There may be someone else who's interested in committing adultery with you and may try to flatter you into giving in. Proverbs 6:24 warns against the flattering tongue of the seductress. So men, keep your egos in check and don't give in to that. Hebrews 13, verse 4 says, let marriage be held in honor among all, for fornicators and adulterers God will judge. I hope and pray that none of you have to sit across the room from a spouse and have to look into their eyes and answer the question, how could you? I'll be back with a free offer. I hope that you found today's lesson helpful, and to help you in your continued study, we'd like to offer you a free copy of today's lesson. Thankfully, members of Churches of Christ make these materials available to our viewers absolutely free of charge. All you have to do is contact us and let us know the name of the program that you'd like to have a copy of, and you can see today's program, the title on your screen, and let us know the format in which you'd like to have it. You can have the program in the form of a written transcript, an audio cassette tape, an audio CD, or a DVD. And you can have any of those formats, and again, it's free of charge. It won't cost you a thing. You can contact us in a number of ways. We have an 800 number that's a voicemail system where you can leave the pertinent information. The number is 800-819-2966. Or if you would like to email that request, our email address is requests@thetruthinlove.com. Or you can go to our website, which is www.thetruthinlove.com, and our materials are available there. You can fill out an order form. Or if you want to send us a postcard or a letter, our mailing address is Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas, 76053. And again, we stress to you there is no cost or obligation. We just want you to have the material. We thank you for watching.
Often conquered men, as a sense of weakness brought distress within. Christ will sanctify you if you claim His best. In the Holy Spirit He will give you rest.